Hey, this is the one-man gold mine, the one-man enterprise of professional wrestling and all entertainment, Flynn Hendricks. And you better believe when I'm looking for a good podcast to listen to, I go to my own. I go to the I Know You Hear Me podcast hosted by me, Flynn Hendricks. That is such a fresh perspective for how you should look at life, too. I love that. And then when I'm feeling spooky, I go to my other podcast, Tales from the Haunt, where I want my head shoved inside a 15-pound silicone mask. More. I want to have a bucket of sweat coming off me at the end of the night than just Jeff.
Dogs don't lay eggs, Flynn.
I hate you so much.
Talk to other scare actors about what it takes to get into the world of scare acting. So if you're curious about how people became professional wrestlers, actors, prioritized their mental health, became entrepreneurs, avoided burnout, or got into scare acting, you need to go check out I Know You Hear Me and Tales from the Haunt, available on all podcasting platforms. And I know you hear me.
Hi, this is Bob Smith. You might remember me from my years at Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine. Well, now I've started a brand new podcast called The Outdated Wrestling Hour. Yes, we're going to take a whimsical look back at the wrestling figures, stars, and trends from years gone by. We're talking 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and a whole lot more. There's going to be laughs, there's going to be fun, there's going to be action, you name it. Please tune in for the Outdated Wrestling Hour wherever you get your podcasts.
Available on all streaming platforms. It's professional wrestling's greatest, largest, privately owned wrestling library. All the classic hits, flips, slams, and pins of yesteryear are on one place. It's Ultimate Classic Wrestling. Check out the Nature Boy Ric Flair, Hulk Hogan, Mr. USA Tony Atlas, Tito Santana, Rick Martel, a who's who of professional wrestling's greatest spotlight stars ever to grace the squared circle, all in one place. Grab the best seat in the house for memories and mayhem on Ultimate Classic Wrestling.
Wrestling fans, promoters, wrestlers, and anyone who enjoys pro wrestling now have something new to be excited about. The Wrestling Fans International Association, the WFIA, is back. WFIA is an association that exists to promote, grow, and support professional wrestling throughout the world. Membership is free. Your membership includes a free digital bi-monthly publication of the Wrestling Fan News newsletter, association updates, voting privileges, and much more. Please go to thewfia.org, that's thewfia.org, and become a member today.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to the PWZ podcast. This is Rick Del Santo. Joining me today, former PWI writer Bob Smith and host of the Outdated Wrestling Hour. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm great. And I'm really thankful to be here. It's nice to meet you, and it's nice to be here. I've been enjoying a lot of your work. I just listened to your work with Mary Savoldi and Brian Webster, two guys that I know quite well. And I really enjoyed that show. It was great.
Thanks. That show was like 2 years in the making, literally. I tried to get Mario a couple years ago when I was first starting this. He said yes, and then of course, it took a while. And then I have to say thank you to Daniel, the guy that's over there, the content builder over there, or the guy that's digitizing everything for them for their network, and finally hooking us up. And Brian Webster, I've always wanted to talk to because I always admired his presentation when covering professional wrestling, when being a part of IWCCW and stuff. I always thought he was a great commentator. So finally to be able to get in touch with him was awesome. I wish we could have had a deeper conversation in his career as well.
He was great, wasn't he?
Yeah.
I mean, he was legitimately good. I mean, I'm not blowing smoke because, there were a lot of announcers that think he was natural. He didn't force the issue, had a smooth delivery. He was really good. A good looking kid. Yeah. I mean, I really thought he had big things go. I don't know what happened, but I got an opportunity to actually do color with him on an entire TV taping, and I thought he was fantastic. Well, he's one of those guys. Also, when you met him, you felt like you knew him for 10 years, which didn't hurt. He was a really nice guy. So I'm glad that he's back on the scene in any way because he was terrific. And I think he helped the Savoldis out a lot when he took over that seat. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we were discussing off air. They had random commentators on their show for a while. Like you said, Chris Cruz was there for a little while. I remember that era.
Mhm.
I do remember Les Thatcher there for quite some time during the 80s.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember. I can't think offhand who else was there during the earlier 90s besides Brian. Really, I can't go back.
I'm trying to remember when Tony Atlas was managed by Boston Bad Boy Tony Rumble. I'm trying to remember who was doing play-by-play at that point because it was pre-Brian at that point.
Yeah.
And I can't think of who it was.
I thought Brian and Tony Rumble were a good team at times, like when they were teamed up together for commentary.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Rumble had the gift of gab, didn't he? He really did.
Oh, yeah. He was great and sorely missed in this world of wrestling that we don't get to witness him at this day and age. It's a truly a shame. He was great.
You know what? He got it. Tony Rumble got it. He understood the psychology of the heel really well, and he made fans hate him. Hardly tried, and he had him in the palm of their hands, and that's the secret of being a good manager, I think.
Yeah. Have you subscribed to their network yet at all?
No, but I know about it.
Yeah.
It just kind of appeared. I'm a Roku guy. I watch a lot of YouTube and other wrestling networks that stream, and I do have it already. I ordered that network. I haven't subscribed yet, but I think I'm going to because why would I not? I mean, it must be hours and hours of entertainment on there.
They keep adding stuff too. The other night I watched the from East Lyme, Connecticut, which is probably about 30 minutes from where I live here. They had a show, an AWA and ICW show, like a split show. From I think 1986 or whatever, and that was a lot of fun. Literally, to see people like Scott Hall and stuff like that, and Shawn Michaels, Marty Jannetty in an ICW ring. Playboy Buddy Rose and Doug Summers was on it. Man, it was just a great show. It's the content on that app is just so much fun to go back and relive your 1980s Savoldi territory.
Right, and they went through so many permutations and were all interesting. For a while, they had Paul Heyman booking, if you remember that.
Yep.
Then there was the period with they had Blackjack Mulligan and Fallen Angel and Kevin Sullivan in.
Yep.
And then it would move from one thing to another thing, but it was always interesting. Then the Kutcher Mania era, right?
Yes.
Oh, by the way, that I was carted out on a stretcher legit at a Kutcher Mania.
What happened?
I actually got sick. I shouldn't even. I was there to do my usual commentary plus, shoot for PWI, and something happened with one of my kidneys. To this day, they still don't know what wrong, but my temperature shot up. My face turned red. I went back to my room, and somebody came to visit. They said, I'm calling an ambulance because they thought I was in a bad way, and I was. In fact, they even gave me morphine in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. I was in such pain.
Wow.
They checked me out from stem to stern and never really gave me a good reason for it, but they believed that I was doing the Atkins diet. They think it blew out a kidney a little bit with the lack of carbohydrate at that point. And once I ate a few carbs, I felt better in like a week. But I was really sick. I really got sick. I just couldn't function.
What year was this roughly? Was the Atkins diet a thing back then, or was it just not as popular?
Well, we're probably looking between 89 and 91 probably at that point.
Okay. I don't think that had reached its peak at that point yet.
No, at the early Atkins diet, they just told you eat meat and cheese all the time. There was no variety to it. So it was like, The Atkins diet worked on me. I was burning the ketones. That was the problem. I was getting real results. I had lost like 30 pounds in a month. Yeah. But then I got greedy and wanted to lose more, and I think that's where I got myself in trouble. I overdid it.
Right.
And I think it just made my system break down, and thankfully I got over that. But, when I had that attack, I couldn't figure out what the hell was going wrong with me, and so I was stretchered out of the promoter called me. What was it, Bob Ruskin at that point?
He was part of the NWF, correct?
But who was the promoter? Somebody was working with Mario. And he called me. He called me and he said, "I'm really sorry. I heard you got stretchered." I said, "Yeah." He actually called me both in the hospital and to the office to check up on me. So I really appreciated the concern that everybody had back at the at Kushner's. But it was kind of, I was more embarrassed than anything else, to be honest with you.
You didn't take a bump and have to be carted out. It was
that
just
would have been that I would have been proud of. I only took one bump in my wrestling career, and it was at a tri-state card.
This is Joel Goodhart's tri-state card.
Funk bashed Jerry Lawler, who went into a trio of referees. They all went falling down like bowling pins, and one of them knocked me down. That's the one bump I took. So this is actually a funny story. So I actually got knocked for a loop, but I wasn't hurt. So I sat up. I remember being in a sitting position, and I'm looking across the ring, and I see Terry Funk. He's giving me those dagger eyes. I went, oh, no. And I'm thinking he's thinking that I'm trying to be part of the show, and I wasn't. I legitimately got knocked down. So what I did is, think quick, Bob. What are you going to do? I grabbed my back, held my back, and slowly walked to the back. Like I got hurt. I have to get out of here. And I didn't want any part of Terry Funk because he was giving me the evil eye. And if you know Terry Funk, he doesn't shut it off when the light is on. But the story has a happy ending. I'm in the hotel bar in Philadelphia afterwards, and I see Terry Funk is sitting at a table, and he's going like this. I went, oh, God, he's going to give me a tongue lashing for getting involved in the match. So I walk over and go, hi, Terry. He goes, will you buy me a beer? Beautiful. So I go, and he invites me to sit down, and he says, I explain what happened. I said, yeah, I got knocked over. He said, yeah, I saw what happened. But, he couldn't shut it off.
Yeah.
When he was doing his thing, I mean, he was on. Even backstage, it would take him minutes to cool off. If you ever saw him in a backstage area after a match, he was still Terry Funk backstage until maybe a half hour of the match went in. But I love that about those guys. They lived their gimmicks. They lived their personas.
Yeah.
They didn't want anybody to not think that what people were watching was legitimate. I love that. The Sheik, Terry Funk, all those guys that lived it, I give them nothing but respect and props because that's when it was good,
Yeah. I grew up in the 1980s. Wrestling was a completely different product. Obviously, what you're talking about is probably the same era. It's probably, was that early 90s? 91, 90, 1991?
Yeah, something like that.
So we were still stuck in that great era of professional wrestling. It's hasn't gone completely downhill yet at that point.
Well, what my saving grace was in those days? I was at PWI when WWF had Papa Shango. Oh, man. Papa Shango, and WCW was bringing in all their characters. But my saving grace was a lady named Emmy Yates in Atlanta, Georgia, because Joe Pedicino in Atlanta had an 6 to 8 hour wrestling block every Saturday night.
Yep.
This lovely young woman would tape those shows and send them to our office every week. And I got to see Continental, Smoky Mountain, stuff you wouldn't have an opportunity to see. A little Georgia Championship Wrestling, but it wasn't the other Georgia Champ. It was like this little tiny federation.
Yeah, I know which one you're referring to. I think some of those are up on YouTube. Yeah.
Yeah, Sid Vicious got to start there.
Yep.
And Nick Busick was working there at that point. Also, they had I don't know if I said Continental. Mm-hmm. They had Savoldi. They had a WWF B show. And probably an NWA show. So all combined, that was a lot of stuff every Saturday night. And I watched every frame of it except the stuff I had already seen, like WWF. And I learned so much about the territories and was such a territories fan that at PWI, if you already noticed what I did back then, I wrote about the territories a lot. I didn't like writing about Hulk Hogan. Anybody could do that. Mm-hmm. I wanted to kind of show the rest of the world what the territories were doing. And I found out that people appreciated that because even into the 90s, that was the only way people could find out what was going on in Kentucky and Memphis and all these other places. It was still territorial at that point. So when I had an opportunity to bring people the first look at Rob Stokowski, who turned into Rob Van Dam, or the Hardys, or a lot of other people, I gave Sid Vicious his first big publicity, I think. Cactus Jack, when he was first coming up, I would go back to the office and got to push this guy. At least I had a voice in helping getting the word out about young stars that eventually made it, and I'm very proud of that.
I remember you just brought up Rob Van Dam. I remember the first time I ever saw him, and I probably didn't realize until it was like a little bit after, but the first time I ever saw him was in, if you remember, the IWF that would air on Sports Channel America.
Right.
Do you remember that show? That's the first time I ever saw him. He came out there and I could say he wasn't too impressive at that time period. It was going to be probably about another 5 or so years before he had become Rob Van Dam and put that work in. You know what I mean? So,
well, I saw him in Memphis. I saw him open a card against Nightmare Danny Davis. I can't remember. I went to Memphis in '91. I saw 2 cards. I saw one in the next state over, and then I saw the Memphis regular Monday night card, which was one of the biggest thrills I ever had. I got to be on the Channel 5 show. I mean, I got to get ingratiated to a scene I really enjoyed. I loved Memphis wrestling. To be able to go there was just awesome. Everybody was so good to me. But anyway, he was still Rob Stokowski at this point. And he took on Nightmare Danny Davis, and I'm telling you, today it's the best opening match I ever saw in front of nobody, and no TV or anything. But these guys worked their butts off. And I went back to the office and said, we got to do an introducing feature in the wrestler on this guy because he's going to be good. And I think it was not a couple of years later, he was Rob Van Dam. So at least I picked him out of a lineup. I saw that there was something special about him.
Became one of the biggest draws in the probably 1990s and into the 2000s, probably, or one of the biggest names at least, Rob Van Dam.
Well, dig this. At Memphis at that point, they had Rob Stokowski, Rob Van Dam, Sabu, and a guy named Judge Dredd. And I think all 3 were trained by the Sheik.
Okay.
And this was one of their first ventures outside of Detroit or doing stuff with the Sheik, I guess. And it was kind of cool to meet them all, and they were fantastic. And I thought they were all had futures. Judge Dredd was just a really, really big guy. I don't know what happened to him, but the other 2, you could see from the beginning there was just something different about them. And hats off to the Sheik for training both of them because look at the careers they had.
Right. What I just want to go backwards.
Sure.
In your interest for a little bit, but I want to know how you got interested in professional wrestling. There's always a really weird story by anybody, or how you got how you discovered it and what drew you to it. And talk about your first show as well.
I was always fascinated by it, even as a little kid. Because I remember one time, and I don't remember the wrestler, and I'm telling you, I was probably 6, 7 years old.
Yeah.
Man, I've never told anybody this story. And I'm watching TV, and we had a color TV, and I think Vern Gagne got busted open.
Wow.
So I go into the kitchen and tell my mom, I said, Mom, the guy's bleeding on TV over here. He's got all, and they said, yeah, it happens to wrestlers. My mother was very matter of fact. They said, yeah, it's wrestling. Wow. And that's my first memory of watching wrestling. I just saw the guy got hurt. But it was around 1970 that, like I said, I'm from the Albany, New York area.
Right.
And they got, of all things, the NWF, the Pedro Martinez, came into Albany, made it part of their, people don't remember that. It was part of their territory, along with Cleveland, Buffalo, Utica.
Okay.
I think those are the only places that they promoted. But there was a place that always had professional wrestling in Albany called the Washington Avenue Armory, which was naturally in Washington Avenue in Albany. So that was what they were using for the arena. And the name of the show was Championship Wrestling with Johnny Powers. And it was 1970. And I remember I thought that Johnny Powers was the greatest wrestler in the world because that's what Jack Reynolds in the show was telling me. A big, handsome guy, Canadian guy. And they had quite the lineup. They had Ernie Ladd and the Mongols, early Mongols. Little Abner Osborne, Mighty Igor, Abdullah came in around 71, 72. Because they were, trying to think, just Eric the Red, Kurt Von Hess were a tag team at that point. That's the first wrestling I remember and really got into that. But I was still a kid. I was still junior high, whatever. And then they left television, replaced about 6 months later in 72 by Worldwide Wrestling Federation with Vince McMahon. Actually, it was weird, and I remember this too. The first show had Bill Caudle on lead as the main announcer. The next week, Vince McMahon was on. I don't know if they showed some old show before they brought on a new show, which may have been the case.
Yeah.
But promoter Ted Bailey in Albany promoted the previous thing, the NWF, and then he was the promoter for WWF after a while. I don't know if Vince ran him off or if they just decided not to promote there, but it wasn't all that long before. Wrestling was always on Sunday mornings at 11 in Schenectady, WRGB. Hello, upstate. How are you? And tremendous memories. I mean, TV wrestling. And then 72, it was Cicluna and King Curtis, Sonny King, Chief Jay Strongbow, Pedro Morales was the champion. Tony Gurria was a rookie. Great memory. Dominic DiNucci, you know the crew. The whole, Bruno was around a little bit. So high school era, my friend Rick Stickles got a car, and my friend Larry Van Dyke went with us too. And I think we would go to the Washington Avenue Armory and watch these terrible cards. I mean, this was a B or C stop on the WWF territory. Right. I mean, they'd have a decent main event. Let's say, what did I see once? Tony Gurria versus Superstar Graham for the title. Mm-hmm. Or Peter Maivia versus Graham was another one I distinctly remember. But the first main event I think I ever saw was Ivan Putski against Ivan Koloff.
Okay.
But the way these cards were set up was like you got to see three, real prelim matches. I mean, it wasn't a lopsided match. It was Steve King versus Joe Turco. I don't know if this is predating you. Probably it is, but we're talking.
No, I know who they are.
The TV guys, the Gypsy Rodriguez versus Baron Cicluna instead of somebody you knew.
Right.
It was, but that was the day of the slow build on the cards. Scientific match. You'd see a good guy versus good guy, and then they'd have a co-main event and then the main event.
Right.
Usually they put the main event on, I think, the middle of the show. And I know it was such a fan favorite house. It was such a face house that I remember they always ended the show with the faces winning because they'd have a riot if they didn't. It was an older crowd, cigarette smoke in the air, and hair, the old ladies in the front row. And, it was a serious, that crowd would get heated. Yeah. So I think to keep the peace, they always had a face win the final match of the night.
That was pretty much how it was, the formula back in the day. Like the babyface usually, for the most part, right? Would win the main events. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Not even the main event, whatever they threw on last. Because sometimes, scheduling the championship match or a tag team championship would be in the middle of the show. And then they'd have other stuff on, as long as they had, somebody that they knew in the last match. That's usually how it worked.
Usually probably not to go past curfew or whatever. Because back then there was curfew for a lot of those places.
Yeah, there was.
Back in the day. Yeah.
But I will say this, old rickety wooden chairs, bleachers. I think the place must have held 3,500, 4,000 at most. And I loved every minute of it, man. I never left one of those shows thinking that sucked. No, I thought they were all great. I didn't care who I saw, Rocky Tamayo. It didn't matter what wrestlers were on there. It was the guys I was seeing on TV live under the big light. And, I was fascinated. I was hooked. Those cards made me a fan for life. They really did.
It's amazing that something like that. I still do watch wrestling. It's been like 40 years probably. I discovered in 1984, so it's reaching up on the 40. There's probably like 2 years in between that I didn't watch. You know what I mean? So,
right.
Not that any fault of my own. It's just that probably I divorced my first wife, so there was like a gap when I was going through that I probably didn't keep up on the product. But once I met my second wife and her son was like huge WWE fan, I got really back into wrestling again and eventually started this podcast probably like a year later. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I don't know what to say other than I have kept up with it until the pandemic. I'm not the biggest AEW fan in the world. There's something about it that rubs me the wrong way, and I can't even put my finger on it. There's something about it, how they're kind of thumbing their nose at traditional pro wrestling that bothers me. And I know they do. It's considered cool that they're thumbing their nose at the traditions of professional wrestling. I've seen stuff on that show that would never fly. I just think a lot of it's vulgar when it doesn't need to be and bloody when it doesn't need to be. And I'm not against violence in wrestling at all. Yeah. I'm a Fred Blassie fan, but think that there's no limits to what they do. I'm afraid people are going to get hurt. You know, and too many of the fan base is more interested in what's going on backstage than what's going on in the ring, and I have no use for that personally. To me, and what my podcast is all about is what happened in the ring. Yeah. I really don't care about what happens backstage. That's for them. I liked it better when the curtain was pulled tight shut. I liked it better then. I don't know what to say, but that's just my vibe on it.
No, you're right, because that's the problem with wrestling in the last 20 years. People know too much because of the internet. The internet helped expose, I mean, not that, it wasn't exposed, but expose professional wrestling as far as like everybody knows everything. Anything that happens backstage, guys like Meltzer and Mike Johnson and stuff, they're going to write about it. And it's no fault of their own. It's their job to sit there and report stuff, but it's everybody considered a smart mark, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. You know
what? It's actually worse than that, because now, I watched WrestleMania. Was it WrestleMania or I don't remember. One of the
WrestleMania was just like last week or whatever, 2 weeks ago. So,
yeah, but no, it was one of the recent pay-per-views. They're not even pay-per-views anymore. I watch them on Peacock.
Yeah.
And they have press conferences with the wrestling media afterwards where they expose everything.
Yep.
They're talking about creativity and la-di-da and, booking and I'm like, they just fell right into it, didn't they?
Yeah.
Line and sinker. If that suspension of disbelief leaves wrestling, it will fail. I am convinced it won't last long. I don't want that to happen. Trust me. I'm not saying I want it to happen, but if you can't appreciate the craft of making a predetermined fight look real, what's the point? It's just a show then. It's glow with men. It's like, I don't know what to say. I'm very disappointed. I'm just.
Well, that's the thing is, I'm
not saying that they should go back to kayfabe. I know the genie's out of the bottle. You can't put the stopper back in it, but the flavor is wrong. It's like I just, I don't know if I'm describing this properly, but
no, I get what you're saying. I mean, I've been a fan for 40 years. I prefer the old style. It's just there's too much exposure nowadays. It's just AEW doesn't do it for me. What I supported them in the beginning because I'm just like, all right, it's a new company, because I'm like, all right, this could be good for the industry. I was watching the early shows. I'm like, it's okay, but there's a lot of kinks to be worked out. It got good for a little bit, but I'm just like, look at this guy. This guy just dislocated his arm just because he did some stupid stunt.
Right.
Guys, there's 5 tables on top of each other. This dude just ripped his ankle. It's just stupid injury after stupid injury. John Moxley on TV every single week cutting himself. The camera caught him right there on screen cutting himself. It's just, to me, it's ridiculous. And it's just, that kind of ruins the entire product for me. Do I tune in on occasion because there's people I know that sometimes make their way up there, whether they're getting squashed or whatever on TV. So I'll tune in. Other than that, it's just, I didn't watch it for months and months. Like, I probably the beginning of the year up until about 3 weeks ago, I didn't watch it. And I wasn't happy when I decided to go back to it. You know what I mean? There just wasn't anything that was interesting to me.
I watched a match about a month ago, and some guy, because I don't even bother to learn their name, some guy slams another guy onto the approach to the ring.
Yeah.
But there's an obvious, this is typical TBS. TBS could never shoot wrestling. You have to shoot that flat. And I'll tell you why. They had a crash pad there. So, they shot it from looking up, down on it. So you see the guy land on the crash pad. You bounced a little bit. An indentation in the floor. And Shivani's going, oh, he might have broke his back. I'm going, we saw the crash pad, dude. I mean,
there's padding that you could just see.
Yeah.
It's just it's. I think the first time it happened, I think Jericho came off the top of a cage or somebody came off
that.
Yeah, and it just
he fell on a pillow.
Yeah, you saw the cardboard that was making it flat. It was just crazy looking. It just a lot of people made fun of that for a long time.
I mean, you could do that, but you have to shoot. At least when the WWE did the ridiculously bad Bray Wyatt LA Knight match.
Oh God!
At least they shot the Uncle Howdy character doing the elbow drop from up in the sky, wherever he came from. At least they shot it at a base level so you couldn't see what he landed on.
Mm-hmm.
Here in AEW, they don't even, the producers don't even know where to shoot. So when they're doing a little sleight of hand, you can see it blatantly be super duper fake. I hate that. It's the best way to put it. I mean, it's just one hand's got to wash the other, and it's like AEW. It's almost as if the wrestlers book their own matches. There's no control over what happens. There's no control over language. There's no control over violence. There's no control.
They have
wrestling. I think works best when you have a central booker who kind of controls the atmosphere. And the guys get a step two, or they don't have jobs. Now it's like everybody invited their friends to come and wrestle. There's nothing everybody else doesn't complain about.
They have they do have creative input, I believe, or very, strong input from what I understand. They could, I wouldn't say entirely book their own matches, but they have a very big influence, a lot of these wrestlers over there, on what they say goes, from what I understand. I mean, that just makes more sense. I mean, the way it happens, it unfolds that way. So it's crazy.
The problem with that is it depends on the wrestler.
Yeah.
Some of them are very mature and they understand the psychology. Others are just trying to either get themselves over or create some kind of wacky spot. There's another thing. You think anybody could watch a 50-minute mat wrestling match anymore? I don't think so. They'd boo them out of the arena no matter how good they were. That bothers me.
I just watched, I don't know. Do you watch GCW at all? Game Changer Wrestling.
I've never even seen her.
No, they have a show each year. Josh Barnett books Bloodsport, which is basically kind of like an old shoot. If you remember the old UWFI out of Japan, or it's basically a show like that once a year, where it's all like shoot wrestling style stuff. It's and I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Jeff Cobb, who I love. I think he was a great wrestler. He's an amateur, and damn, I'm trying to remember who he wrestled, but it was a complete, like, straight wrestling match the entire time.
Right.
I'm sitting there with people and being like, is there anything that's going to happen? It's like, you're kind of missing the point. That's not what this is. That's not the kind of wrestling we're watching. It's like, and I loved it because it's just straight wrestling. The other night I was watching MLW, and it was Alex Kane and Davey Boy Smith Jr. They took the ropes off the ring and had a catch wrestling match. I thought it was phenomenal because it was just a straight wrestling match.
Oh, see, maybe there is hope for the future after all.
Well, MLW, while I do like them a lot, there is a couple things there that I don't completely like. That's kind of turns me away on times. But I do, as far as like current wrestling goes, MLW, I think is one of the better ones out there.
Interesting take. I did try them for a while. I try everything. I dabble. Yeah. I can't stop watching. It's in my blood. It's like I'm old. I watch Raw every week. I got the fast forward on, but I watch it. Because 3 hours of that is a lot. But I still find some of the things interesting. I think the WWE puts on a phenomenally slick, particularly like WrestleMania, slick, well produced. Great athletes. You can't take it away from them. I think Rhea Ripley's awesome. I think the match with Gunta and
that was a great match. I love that match.
And Drew McIntyre and Sheamus is as good as any match I've ever seen. Tremendous. It's nice that they can have things like that. I mean, they still once in a while hit the ball out of the park, and that makes whatever else went on during the 8 hours of WrestleMania worthwhile to me. So I gave it a B+. I thought there was a lot of good stuff on those shows.
I thought night one was phenomenal. I literally, and that's the highest rating I've ever given any WWE show. I thought it was possibly,
yes.
I walked away extremely happy from night one, and I was like, I've never said that about a WWE show. You know what I mean? That's from top to bottom, it was awesome.
Well, there's the thing. I did a podcast on Monday. I don't usually. I just did a bonus podcast because I'd seen all of WrestleMania. I'm supposed to talk about it, right. And I said at that point, I gave WrestleMania an A after the first night because it was like, what was there not to like? There was so much good stuff on there. I mean, it was tremendous. The Rhea Charlotte match, my God.
Great match, yeah.
And you know what I loved about that match? You'd think it was a real fight.
Right.
It looked like a real fight.
Yeah.
It was awesome. So night two comes around, and I'm beating a dead horse here, but I'll talk to you about it. The main event. The Roman Reigns has become Ed Farhat. What killed Detroit and Toronto? The Sheik would do the same match every week, and the fans stopped showing up, and it burned out his whole territory. The Roman Reigns thing has got, with the constant outside interference, match after match after match. It's predictable. It's not exciting. It's infuriating. It's been going on for 2 years now.
Right.
It's enough. It's over. I mean, how is this still being perpetuated? I mean, there's never any price paid for having Solo Sikoa interfere in a match, or the Usos, or even Heyman at times interferes. Roman Reigns has never won a title defense on his own. Not one.
That's the thing that I've brought up here on this podcast before. It's just, it's got to happen once in a while, right? You would think. It's got to. But it has not for 2 years. I've gone off on rants for a good 10 or so minutes as to why it should happen. And that I get it, he's a heel. And I get it's the modern era, but come on, man. Like, every single match, he's got to have interference in order to get a win. What kind of champion is that? Remember when, back in the day when we were growing up, they were presented as champions. It's like they have to be able to win some on their own, not always a weapon, but that's also WWE style booking for years. And I thought that, I thought that match was very good up until they started, you knew the ending was coming.
Right.
Like, it was so overbooked with all that interference, like the last 15 or so minutes. And it was aggravating to tell the truth. It was literally like wanting to pull my hair out, aggravating.
Well, at one point early in the match, you hear Michael Cole comparing Reigns to San Martino and Backlund and Pedro Morales. And I'm like, no, he's the honky tonk man. Remember Peggy Sue and Jimmy Hart interfered in the match? So what's the difference? That's a better comparison.
Yeah.
At one point, the Honky Tonk Man was the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time.
Yep.
Because he had all that outside interference. What's the difference? There is none. Now, look,
you're right.
I'm not putting Roman Reigns down as a performer, as a great wrestler. He's got the look. He's got the style. I mean, he is very good at what he does. There's no question about that.
Right.
But you know what? They're beating a dead horse here. I don't know how the fans feel about it, but and remember when the match was over, you saw them panning to the disappointed faces in the crowd. I don't think it was so much that Cody lost. I think it was because they said, we're going to watch 6 months of this stuff again. That's what they were saying.
Right.
I rest my case. I
think you're right.
They have stayed with this too long. People like clean finishes, Remember what happened at night one? They were all clean finishes. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing night one. Night two, while I thought it was good, I think the main event kind of brought it down, and of course the Miz segments on both nights kind of brought my rating down a little bit. So
night two of WrestleMania was when they closed Shea Stadium after losing the final game of the season, would knock them out of the postseason. So the fans watched it and they went a tepid yay when they should be cheering. Right. That's what that felt like at WrestleMania. It was like. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Then the women's showcase did nothing for me as well. Like the 4-way tag match or whatever, that one.
They had to do a men's showcase and women to get more people into WrestleMania, just to get them into WrestleMania and not devalue them. I think that's the reason those matches existed. That was it. I understood it, so it didn't bother me too much.
Do you remember in the 80s into the 90s where not every single wrestler was on WrestleMania?
Right.
They built up their 7 or 8 matches. Now they make WrestleMania 5-6 hours. I mean, before the pandemic, when it was only one night, they were probably almost 8-hour shows just because they wanted to get every single member of the roster on. Growing up, it wasn't like that. It was just the best of the best super show. Now they're just every single person because they need to fit every single person on the roster in there. And I don't like that. It's just, it's like, I don't know who to compare it to. It's like seeing Red Tyler on WrestleMania or somebody to that effect. You know what I mean? Well, it's just they have to bring every single person in.
Well, not just that. They need to make time for all the cross-promotional stuff they were doing. Cinnamon Toast Crunch match with the Mysterios. So you got all this bitterness, and they're wrestling. And Michael Cole is talking about the delicious, tasty cereal with 8 essential vitamins. I mean, what? It doesn't even make sense. And then you look at the corner of the screen, there'd be some other business and some other tie-in and some other deal. I mean, we understand how that all works, but I thought it was like product placement galore on this WrestleMania, like I've never seen.
Well, if you remember, what was it? A couple of years ago, they were in partnership with some zombie movie or something like that.
Right.
And then the Miz got eaten by a zombie and disappeared. It's just like, come on, dude. It's like, that's how you're working this into the show, that you basically killed off a character and then he showed up again a couple months later. It was a little bit booked. Like it felt like watching Vince Russo book, something to that effect. Like when he was booking, like when he had free reign over WCW or Impact.
It didn't rise to that level. No, I hate to say it. It was ridiculous. I mean, again, that was pandemic era, and they were so desperate during the pandemic. They set fire to Bray Wyatt. They had, Alexa Bliss with her magical powers. AEW had Matt Hardy transporting himself around the arena by magic.
Oh, I hated that.
There was all kinds of stuff that wouldn't have happened if they had fans in the arena. They were so... And cinematic matches, my God, please make it stop. Make it stop.
I'm glad you're in agreement on that, because I literally could not sit there. There's a lot of people that love that Undertaker AJ Styles match. I was like, I can't take this. And of course, the next night was, Bray Wyatt and John Cena.
Right.
You know what I mean? Which was just like a freaking bad acid trip watching that thing. And God knows what else there was. Like throughout that, and Impact is guilty of it as well. They did something with like EC3 when he returned there for a while, and it was just so crazy. And the cinematic matches, I think they just do absolutely nothing for me. Some people like them, but I just don't understand how. Like, it's not considered professional wrestling to me.
No, exactly right. Bingo, you nailed it. And I talked about this in my podcast. In Impact Wrestling, there have been 2 simulated murders.
Yes. Wasn't Rob Van Dam one of them? Like,
I'm counting the Bunny.
Okay.
The Bunny was stabbed to death at one point by another female wrestler, and because she had her job with AEW or whatever that was. Yeah. And more recently, the Eric Young thing.
Okay, because he's going back to WWE.
That was his write-off.
Yeah, and I remember.
So they have to kill him to write him off? I mean,
yeah.
Come on, folks.
I remember it was Rob Van Dam. This is probably, and he was, that's when he was like at his peak in Impact, I guess, if you want to call it his peak in Impact.
Yeah.
He had fought Abyss at the time, and they just show backstage him just covered in blood, like they had poured a bucket of blood over him and just laying on the ground, and then you never saw him again. That was it.
So
I think he was back in WWE. Yeah, like shortly after.
Okay, great guys, great.
Yeah. I don't understand how that, like, and then they do. Impact does a lot of supernatural stuff. Look at Rosemary and Susie, all that stuff. It's just.
I think that was the scene with the bunny. It was so weird, and there was James Mitchell and Kevin Sullivan were in it, and it was just all this weird stuff ending with. It's so bad. Oh God, is it awful? I'm sorry. It's just. Well, that's why they have bounced from network to network to network and never really made an impact in over 10 years.
It's been 23, I believe, or 22 years. So, right. Yeah. So,
can you believe at their height when they had virtually every name wrestler in the world at one point? They still didn't make an impact. I mean, it's a miracle that they didn't take off. It's a miracle with the talent they had.
When they were doing the Nashville Fairground shows, I believe they were letting everybody in for free, if I remember correctly, because they were trying to fill up the seats to make it look better on television.
Well, look, there you go. I mean, it is what it was. I'm flabbergasted. You see, if you kill off the suspension of disbelief to the level that they have, it's just a show, and you can watch a show on Netflix. You can watch a show on CBS. If it's just a show, you don't care because you're going to be eating your Doritos and then you're going to watch another show. It's surface. There's no depth to it. Right. So wrestling shouldn't be a show. Wrestling should be wrestling.
Yeah, That's what I've said. Like a lot of people like that stuff, the entertainment aspect, sports entertainment. That's like watching. Do you watch the current NWA product at all?
Yes.
Or have you given
And
it a shot?
before the pandemic, I was rooting for them so hard. They had a good talent roster. They
Yeah.
were absolutely. I thought they were gaining ground. I love Nick Aldis. They had LA Knight as his old name there. They had James Storm. They had tons of people. They had Jim Cornette doing color.
Yeah.
But one by one, everybody just vaporized, and the current roster now is a shell of what it was. And I'm still rooting for it. They keep saying it's wrestling the way it used to be, the way it ought to be, and it just looks like a cheap version of every indie that I know.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like Impact in a way, but even worse. I mean, they keep advertising that they're doing sellout shows. That last pay-per-view they had. Now, I've been a huge supporter of theirs from the beginning. Like you said, pre-pandemic, it was an amazing show. They were doing stuff right, and then all of a sudden they shut down during the pandemic, and then they were going to come back. And it's like I've purchased every show that they've done, and I'm just like, this. All right, I was like, it's not a great show. It doesn't look like a great show, but they've delivered in the past when stuff doesn't look good. They got Tyrus as their champion. It's just, he does absolutely nothing, especially in the lineage of NWA World Champions. It's just the last show that they did, they keep advertising that they have a sellout arena, yada, yada. 250 people fit in that damn building.
Right.
And they're advertising a sellout. How can you be proud of that?
Yeah. I am still rooting, but I'm starting to wane. It's
because of the history.
I don't understand what, William Patrick Corgan is doing right now. If he was at Loggerheads, I guess, with Nick Aldis, and he left, and I understand that. It's fine. But, they're still trying to sell tradition with some of the stuff they're showing now. I mean, it just doesn't, I hate to say it, just a lot of charismaless talent there. There's a lot of people who will never make it on an AEW or WWE, and that they're featuring as main players. I hate to say it, but it's true.
I mean, they're bringing in guys like Bobby Fulton in. I mean, I feel bad for Bobby being on this program. You know what I mean? The guy's a legend, and he just does not look at his best health wise. And
he wasn't his best health up until recently, right? I mean,
correct. Yeah, he has was it some sort of cancer? I don't remember exactly what, but it's like they're really pushing him on that show as like I don't want to say an authority figure, but he's feuding with the Fixers. It's just, to me, it's unbelievable. It's not very believable in a way.
Right. Although Wrecking Ball Legursky is my favorite wrestler name right now. I think that's great.
I
love the name. I just love the name. That's awesome.
He's from around these parts.
Is he really?
He lives probably 20 or so minutes from me. I see him regularly on independent shows in my area. And I guess I can break that news now that I confirmed with him today he's going to be a guest in next week. So,
good for you. That's great.
Yeah. Great guy. So we've been talking about that a long time. It's just we've been having trouble with his schedule being so busy and my schedule with work and stuff like that. So I'm glad to see that we finally come up with a date and time that he's a great guy. He really is.
At least that tag team is old school.
Yes.
That tag team is definite influence from Butcher Vachon and Mad Dog Vachon, that type of thing. It's more just two big tough guys. That's it.
Yeah. I saw a couple matches of his up here that he had another big guy, Adam Kerr, and they were just literally, I thought the ring was going to break. Like, that's how, like, they would slam each other, and it was not like a simple slam. This shit was hard, pardon my language. Like, they were chopping the crap out of each other, and they were just, any bump they took, like, in the ring, you just saw that thing bounce. Like, you thought the boards were going to break. So,
yeah. Oh, man.
It's crazy.
They're okay. I like those guys. There's a few more in the NWA. I mean, I actually like the broadcast crew. I think they do a good job, but I like Tim Storm.
I like Joe Galley. It's just that he gets a little too excited on times. I think he's a great, like when he starts to do that. Remember in like watching AEW, Excalibur is constantly yelling when there's action.
Right.
I think Joe Galley goes for when there's a lot of action going on. He starts yelling. It's like, you don't need to do that every single time.
They're all yelling. Everybody yells. The one downer about the 3-man match at WrestleMania with Gunther was the fact that the 3 announcers were screaming in the top of their lungs the entire length of the match. I guess it's the way of the world now. You have to screech as an announcer.
But who sold it best back in the day? Somebody Gordon Soley, Bob Caudle, when they Lance Russell, they were just so calm when they were selling this stuff, when they were selling these disgusting moments or violent moments and stuff like that, or intense moments. They weren't screeching.
Right. Even Bob Finnegan in Detroit kept his cool. I mean, he was watching the Sheik stab somebody to death, and it's like, oh, this is horrible. He would just keep his cool about it.
Yeah.
You know what I miss? I miss the announcers being outraged at evil doings, villainous behavior. They're not even outraged anymore.
No, it's too commonplace now for them to be.
Yeah,
outraged. It's
the only one doing it is Michael Cole when he talks about Dominic Mysterio.
Yeah,
that's old school outrage that he's doing right there.
And to me, I've always thought Michael Cole was not that great of an announcer, but in the last year or so, depending, I guess, who he works with, he's improved quite a bit. Especially since the initial Vince retirement, I thought that when he was allowed to use certain verbiage, I thought he was actually pretty damn good.
I have a soft spot for Michael Cole for one reason.
Mm-hmm.
I thought his performance on air at a real incident when Jerry Lawler had his heart attack was Emmy worthy.
Yes.
He held the show together, explained rationally what had happened, didn't soft soap anything. He explained Jerry Lawler has had a heart attack. It was one of the great announcer performances of all time over something that was really serious. And I gave him his big props for that. I thought that was a great Michael Cole moment. I thought he couldn't have done it better. He brought the humanity into the moment. And they couldn't stop the show, but he explained fully what had gone on. And I thought that was about as good as anybody could have handled that moment.
Did you see the Lawler biography on A&E?
No, not yet.
No, it was very good, but they showed basically him calling for help in a way while still maintaining his professionalism and trying to, Jerry's having a heart attack. He basically heard him snoring into his microphone.
Yeah.
And, it was really emotional and crazy to watch on TV. It really was.
I'm sure it was.
I think a lot of people just thought it was like, what the hell's going on here? But being a huge Lawler fan, I knew you are. You'd spent some time in Memphis.
I got to spend a week in Memphis, and Jerry Lawler actually opened his home to me, and it was one of the great wrestling experiences I ever had. I just walking in that locker room with all the Memphis regulars, Bill Dundee and everybody else, and Lance Russell wasn't there, but Dave Brown, and it's just the flavor of Channel 5, the flavor of the Memphis wrestling fans. There was nothing like it. To me, it was the last great territory. Yes. It lasted longer than they all did, too. They kept going till like 97, I think.
I think USWA closed in 97, right? And
so they did one hell of a job. I mean, Jerry Jarrett was a great promoter. And, when he left us, I did a bonus podcast. I was really shook up because, to me, those kind of losses are insurmountable. It reminded me when Buddy Rogers died when I was with the wrestling magazines. Those people from the old school who could teach the younger kids about psychology and what works and what doesn't, and technique and everything under the sun. The more we lose those guys, the harder it's going to be to impart those theories onto young people and young wrestlers and young fans.
Right.
It's the walls being chipped away, and it bothers me. I'm an old school guy, and I don't want to see that vibe die entirely. I just don't.
No, you're right. It's like I grew up in the 1980s. It's a little bit after, the era that you discovered it. But I fell in love with the territories that were still around at that time period. When I got home from school every day, it was World Class was on ESPN every single day.
Right.
AWA was on ESPN, and they were, when I discovered wrestling, it was 1984, I believe. So, the AWA still had a few good years left, but they started to flounder probably like 86, 87.
Right.
I thought 88 was a pretty good year still, but like 89 and 90, that's when you can definitely tell this shit's not going to be around forever.
The AWA took a lot of flack when they started running the ESPN shows from the Showboat, but if you cherry pick the best moments of that show, it's as good as anything that was on.
Right.
The Midnight Rockers versus Summers and Rose, that bloody 4-way match, fantastic.
I just watched that the other day. Yeah, it was good.
It's riveting. Have you ever seen such heat?
No, that was a really intense like television match. Like you said, it was bloody as hell on cable TV. It was
They
crazy.
also showed Bockwinkel Henning for an hour.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
and this is a show that got all that flack. Really?
Yeah.
Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko. They had a lot more quality things than people gave them credit for. It was just presented in such an old school fashion. It was considered passé. You know why? It was still wrestling.
Yeah.
And the more that they said we're still wrestling, the more people tuned out, and that was a product of its time. It's like, I don't know what to say other than the show was way better than it got credit for. Way better. It was one of my favorite shows.
I think even in their last year, there was some quality. They might have done some kind of changes to kind of, maybe they're like, hey man, maybe we should catch up with the times. They were trying a couple new things, but which didn't necessarily pan out. But some of the talent that was still there was amazing,
Yeah.
And the commentary team, Lee Marshall and Larry Nelson,
Right.
those guys were awesome. They were great.
Larry left, and as you recall, he was replaced by Eric Bischoff.
Correct. Yep. And Bischoff, went on to whatever he did. So, he became one of the biggest, most influential figures of the 1990s.
You never know. You never know. I mean, Vince Russo was another guy who came out of nowhere, the smallest, humble beginnings to become editor of WWE Magazine. You know how much I would have loved to have that job, after my years with PWI. He wrote a letter to Linda McMahon and got the job.
That's crazy.
I'm like, whoa. I was sending resumes. When Peter and I was moving in 92, 93, I couldn't go.
Mm-hmm.
I had to leave Peter only because it was, mind you, I had just bought property nearby. So it was pre-internet era. There were no cell phones. You couldn't file a story from wherever you were back then. You had to literally be there physically to get your work done. I had to leave it, got another job and left. In fact, I ran out of there because, I had to make a living, So but I guess the point I'm trying to make is I started firing resumes off to WWE. One of our guys got hired, Roy London, the photographer.
Okay.
Got hired by WWE at that point, or WWF. I've tried throughout the years to try to get in, curry favor. I know a couple of wrestlers that work there. I said, could you drop? No, I've never even gotten so much as a fingernail in the door, but you know what? Nobody else does either. You know why? They're looking for TV people, not wrestling people.
Exactly. It's a completely different world. And listening to Brian Solomon's podcast, you can tell what kind of world it is because he has a lot of guys that work in the office there. Mm-hmm. And it's some of the stories are very fascinating about, whether it be creative or who came up with what, or him talking about his time on the magazine. The magazine was almost dead by the time he was there, I believe. I don't know when it stopped publication, to be honest with you. I stopped, I think in the early 90s, I stopped reading WWF magazine. So,
what's funny is even as a wrestling magazine guy, I think I may have read it all that time. Once I knew it was a house organ. I just didn't have any interest in it.
Yeah.
It didn't have any juice to it. It was all rah, whatever. So I really did. Yeah. I didn't have any juice. I don't know about the time when Brian was there, but it was a promotional tool, I thought, more than anything else, and pretty pictures. But I can't vouch for any of the editorial because I never read the thing. So, I worked. Did you know I worked for WCW?
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. I have that here in my notes. You're talking about the later WCW magazine, correct?
Right.
In the later 90s?
Yeah. Now, here's the deal. The original WCW magazine was actually a London product. The PWI family put that out.
Was that the Wrestling Wrap-Up one, or is that
the first WCW magazine was put out by us?
Okay.
Craig Peters was the editor of it, and I would contribute to it. And he kind of left the managing editor role to work on that, and I became managing editor of the other existing magazines. It was a daunting task. They put a lot of money and a lot of time into the original WCW magazine. How well it did, I have no idea. I think they had a 2-year contract, and after 2 years, they actually ceased publishing for a while. By that point, I was pretty much out of there anyway. But I got a phone call from Colin Bowman, the British magazine publisher, after he got the rights to WCW, and I did the second version of WCW with him. He gave me the title of executive editor or whatever that means. It didn't really mean anything. I was freelancing. There was no, I was executive of nothing. But it was a nice hunk of change, and I got to ingratiate myself in WCW a little bit, and never changed. It was always frenetic at WCW, but there was a second version of the magazine. The third edition was done by WCW itself.
Right.
And that didn't last long, but it was a really nice looking book, slick paper with a pop-up centerfold.
Yeah.
You would open it up and you see a match maneuver just pop up like a kid's book. And I thought it was a cool thing. I thought it was innovative. But I think the thing was too expensive to continue to produce that way. And let's face it, at that point, wrestling magazine circulations were going down. And same with the Wrestler and Inside Wrestling. If they were selling, they'd be out today, you know? So that was it's sad to see the demise of the wrestling magazine.
Yeah. I have boxes of them here right on my shelf.
I mean, I collected as a kid. My friends read them. We read them together. We'd have lunch together at a local newsstand. And the world without wrestling magazines, I can't even fathom even at this point. It just doesn't be real, because that was how we all learned about the territories and wrestlers. I never saw the Sheik till I was 21, 22 years old, but I could read about him in magazines. You know, Japan wrestling, Memphis, Kentucky, Florida, Montreal. They were all in the magazines. Whereas I could only watch WWF, I could at least read about them in the magazines. It was a great time. I felt like I was actually learning about wrestling by reading the books back then. And the fact that as an adult I grew up and got a job with them was just mind blowing. And by the way, here's how I got the job. Answered it in the New York Times.
I was going to ask.
Yeah. I was a sports editor of a small newspaper in my hometown called the Catskill Daily Mail in the early 1980s. And I had moved into the New York area and was piddling around at some kind of this is actually kind of funny. I got a job with a music magazine. But at the same time, I noticed an ad in the New York Times. Back then, they had 4 pages of editorial jobs. And I noticed a little 2-line ad in the New York Times that said, Sports Entertainment Magazine seeks writer/editor. Pay benefits. RVC, box something RVC. I said, that's Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I could tell what it was. So I fired up a resume. And I as a sports editor in Catskill, New York, worked with Mike Tyson. I won a major journalism award in New York State for an article I did him when he turned 20 years old. It was an interview. So I made a copy of that, got my best clips together, sent it, and boy, I got a phone call. Because I think they look at me as a boxing wrestling candidate, that I could write both boxing and wrestling. And I talked about this with Craig Peters on my podcast. They gave me a writing test when I showed up for my interview, and they grilled me, man. They sat me in a circle with all the other editors. They asked me, "Why do you want the job? What do you know? Where have you been?" All this, but they gave me a writing test. It was about Sergeant Slaughter. They said, "Write this about this scenario featuring Sergeant Slaughter. We'll give you an hour to write it. Go." And I went, okay, Al DeRusha, blah, 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 blah. Gary DeRusha, blah, blah, blah. You know, I had all these obscure AWA figures because he was in the AWA in the scenario, and I know I nailed it. I know I nailed that writing test, and I got the job based on that. But I think Mike Tyson got me that job more than anything else, because it was like when I first started, I did do boxing. I think I did 3 or 4 articles when I first started. But then I went to Stu Sachs. I said, I prefer the wrestling. I know you hired me to do wrestling. I said, I'd like to stick with the wrestling. And they let me do that. Yeah. And it paid off. So I answered it in the New York Times to work for the Pro Wrestling Illustrated family magazines, which is just that simple. I'm a lucky guy. I'm a really lucky guy. No, I'm very lucky. Oh man, I fell into the whole Mike Tyson world. I was originally a news reporter.
Right.
So, the sports editor left, and they moved me over to the sports desk, and the rest is history. Everything is very, fortunate for me. I'm very grateful for the lucky things that have happened to me in my life. I really am. And not that I didn't work hard, but I stepped in a lot of stuff, man. I'm such a lucky person. I really am.
Was Apter still there at the time?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. What was he like working with?
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome guy. Still a friend of mine. Funny, outgoing, generous with his time. I consider myself still friends with everybody I work with there. And I really mean that. Stu Sachs was the publisher. Dave Rosenbaum, Craig Peters, Andy Rodriguez, Roy London. On it went. Chris Bernucca at the end, at the tail end, was the staff. Eddie Elder was there. I didn't get to work with Dan Shaka. Dan had left his Mortal Coil before I started there. But I considered my tenure there. I told Craig Peters I felt like the Martin Short of London Publishing. He says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, SCTV had a cast, but then John Candy left, and they hired Martin Short." That's who I felt like at the ass end of the run of SCTV. They brought in Martin Short. Well, that's what I was. I think I was hired at the end of the glory years. What would I call the glory years? When they were selling a bunch of magazines and were very popular.
I mean, as much as I still bought into the mid to later 90s, I don't think I have many after, say, 1992, 93. You know what I mean? Because it's just I'm not interested in those as much. I have them through the 70s and 80s up until about 92 or 93. It's just
that's when I left. I was there 80 full time. I was there 88 to 93.
Okay.
And so basically, when you were getting out, I left right around that point because that's when they moved away to Ambler, Pennsylvania, when I had no intention to go.
Yeah. I think I bought the wrestling magazines, Inside Wrestling, The Wrestler, all that stuff. I think I bought them up until, earlier 2000s, whenever they stopped running. I don't have any of those anymore, but that late. But I used to work at a pharmacy, so we used to get a lot of the magazines.
Perfect.
Up until that time, yeah. And growing, my first job, working for my father, I'd get $50 a week or whatever for in the early 1980s, mid 1980s. He owned a television repair shop at the time. That's something you don't see anymore either. We'd go to the newsstand in the plaza. I'd buy all wrestling magazines every single Friday. I'd go in there and buy wrestling magazines.
I hate to admit this because I am a somewhat cultured person with a varied degree of interests, but I will say this. Right up to 2 years, the year before I got a job with PWI, I was buying the books. I was still buying them.
Yeah.
If I saw Inside Wrestling and The Wrestler, I'd just grab it. I would just read those things. I'd read the other brand magazines too that were independent. Napolitano books and stuff like that.
There was New Wave Wrestling as well. Yeah. New Wave Wrestling. I think I still have some of those floating around.
Yeah. I mean, I go way back with wrestling. I remember spending my 50-cent allowance when I was a little kid on Wrestling World.
Yeah.
Or Sports Stars of 1972 wrestling, or and I love, and I talk about this now, and I can openly say it now, being that PWI is a million miles away. My favorites were the Kaiser books. I hate to say it, Wrestling Review, because they had that 20 pages of agate in the back. Right. Remember that? Right in the back, it was all those match results from all over the country.
Yeah,
loved that. I thought that was the best. So I never missed an issue of those things. I love those.
The sections,
magazines, it was that they had that like Minnesota. They would write a headline like you see Vern Gagne on the cover, and the headline would be Vern Gagne, world champion. That would be it. It's all it would say. But you know what? I know they were dry, but there was a lot of information in those books. I think that they did a good job doing that.
I used to buy them and go immediately to the match results and the rankings of all time. I would learn about wrestling that wasn't from my area, some weird group, not to call it weird, but some weird territory or promotion in some weird territory. You know what I mean? Some weird Southern territory.
1977, I learned that Mark Pohl was the New York State champion. I didn't even know where it was. It was like, little guy Mark Pohl, I'd see on prelims. Somehow he was listed as the New York State champion. I'm like, really? That's the kind of stuff that used to make my head spin. It was awesome.
Oh, I always had to try to find stuff, you know what I mean, because of reading those. And of course, in the early to mid 90s, I think I got into the tape trading. If you remember that, at one point, that was a thing. And I used to be able to find certain things. There was a guy here in Connecticut I used to trade with, a couple guys in New York, Texas, California. I used to be able, pre-internet or YouTube, that was the way we found those kinds of wrestling. You know what I mean? Now everything's on YouTube.
Well, in between my PWI years and high school, college, I used to rely on VHS tapes, and there was Pedro Martinez, who used to run the NWF in Buffalo, Utica. When he retired, he started a videotape company called PM Video. company, and he had wrestling. He had Sheik matches. He had other federations, all kinds of stuff. Memphis, and you would ask for what episodes that he had listed, and he would dub them onto a tape and send them to you. It was incredible.
Yeah.
Now, the one thing he didn't have, which is really sad, is his own federation, the NWF, with Johnny Powers and Ernie Ladd and all those guys. The reason was when they sent those tapes to the TV stations, they got them back and taped over.
I heard that happened a lot back in the day.
That happened a lot to smaller wrestling groups. Tape was expensive. They didn't want to buy the cartridges. So they would just tape over them and send them back to the TV stations with new stuff on them.
And that also messed up with the quality as well. Yeah, that messed with the quality as well. Some of them. Sure. And you could see that sometimes some of this stuff is actually surfaces these days. You know what I mean? If it surfaces.
Well, you'd see a tape roll, like the tape was bent. You'd actually see that on the air when you watched the show.
Right.
The tapes weren't fresh.
Right.
But that's one of the great tragedies of the wrestling of the 60s and 70s, that people, the reason the stuff isn't around is they would retape over the tapes.
Yeah. Mind if I ask you a question regarding your career in PWI?
Anything you want.
How is it writing, for lack of a better term, fake stories regarding these professional wrestlers? Like, you basically had to try to keep kayfabe in a way and sort of make up stuff a little bit.
Yes.
What was that like for you?
What was it like?
Did any of these guys ever get mad at you for
no,
creating?
Never, no? Not once. Once. I tried to avoid being really inflammatory in my writing anyway.
Yeah,
because I'd seen most of what I've been writing about, or most of the personalities. Cactus Jack once Mick Foley gave me the greatest compliment I ever had. He said, "You write my voice as well as I say it," and I thought that was the best compliment I ever got from a wrestler, because he really thought that I captured his vibe. And I've had other wrestlers say it too, and that's what I try to do. I try to write like the wrestlers talked, use the same expressions they do. Really nail their personalities and not try to push too far past the boundaries of what they did. Did I enjoy that part of it? To be honest with you, that's one of the reasons I preferred the Kitesurf magazines when I was younger. I thought that a lot of the London stuff was corny. I'll be honest with you.
Okay.
I thought a lot of those kayfabe articles were really corny.
Yeah.
Rick Steamboat's Hidden Torment. I didn't need that. It was like, I want to know who won.
Yeah.
I was an agate guy, even in the sports pages. I like box scores better than the article about the game itself, So as far as writing them, I was good at it because I had read them as a kid and in my older years, and I could pick up the flavor of what they were doing. I'm really good at emulating styles when it comes to writing. So that's a really good question. Nobody ever asked me that. I'll say I did what I had to do. Even though it wasn't my favorite thing to do, I got to do the ratings too.
Yeah.
That was my favorite thing to do. That was just the best. Ratings was as much fun to do as I hope it was for people to read. I know people love the ratings, and I used to weigh the victories. Like a pinfall meant more than a count out, and that both meant more than a disqualification victory. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I really put a lot into it, and they were as accurate as we could make them with the information we got from the promoters. And yes, we did get information from the promoters. We weren't winging it. We worked it. We're hand in hand with the promoter. Bill Apter especially got all kinds of information every Monday. What had happened the previous weekend, who's getting a push, blah, 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 blah. So they were really based on factual information. And anybody who says they didn't work in my office.
I used to see him on TV growing up, whether he'd be the AWA, he was on there. I saw him on NWA, WCW. And of course, the Saboldis, I saw him on there. And it was always fascinating to see that these groups would work with the magazines. To me, at least, I thought it was, pretty fascinating that, WWF wasn't doing that. They were just promoting their own product. So,
right. Well, they threw the magazines out of their venues.
Yeah.
They threw them out.
Was that? Yeah. What was that like, knowing that you guys still had to cover WWF because it was
hilarious.
The largest.
I'll tell you why it was funny.
Go for it.
So right before I took over, that all happened. I'd say right at the expansion period, when they started to put their own magazine out. Miss Elizabeth, that time frame. I only remember that because of the cover with her face on it. Well, anyway, we got around it in some of the funniest ways. it's like, because I shot too. I shot photographs for them too.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd send me to Madison Square Garden, 400 size lens for an Icon body, put it in a Subway bag because we weren't supposed to be shooting. Put it in a Subway sandwich bag and carry it in. Nobody looked sideways. And then discreetly shoot from the third deck. If you notice during those years, you would see ropes in every picture from the WWF because we didn't have ringside.
Right.
So you would actually see ropes. But I got really good at that stuff. I would just open up the shutter as far as I could with black and white 1600 speed film and just shoot. If you really concentrate on the match, you could get, most articles are 6 to 8 pictures anyway.
Right.
You're looking for those sweet spot pictures. The rest can get thrown away. So that's why we handled it. We handled it with photography from everybody we knew that we could get to sit in the perimeter, like the third level of the old 300 seats at the Garden and stuff, and look down on it. And we did a good job with that. I think nobody ever complained. I never heard from the fans. People didn't even know we were thrown out. It was like, we still did our quotes. We'd quote from TV, which is legal. We would quote from people who knew the wrestler kayfabe style. We were able to skirt around the fact that we didn't have access. And I found it hilarious that right before I left, they begged us to come back when they started Monday Night Raw.
Yeah.
At the Hammerstein Ballroom, I think, in the city.
Yeah, it was the Hammerstein Ballroom, and I think
they invited like 4 of us to go. And I remember going to one of the earliest shows. It was how to tide turns when you're desperate, because when business got bad, they brought the magazines back.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was what I remember about the fact that we had been given the bum's rush out of there. It didn't make it easy, but it made it challenging. And I was always afraid of getting caught by Garden security or somebody at the WWF would see you with the big camera lens or whatnot. But somehow we made it work. It worked.
I mean, honestly, I didn't really notice much of a difference, I guess, growing up as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I guess seeing that you mentioned that, if I go back and look at these magazines, I could probably tell the difference a little bit,
Well, here's why it was good to have somebody like Bill Apter. And as well as Roy London and a later guy named Al Bello, who now works for Getty Images. He's one of the top sports photographers in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a studio, and we would have wrestlers up in the office as often as we could, especially stars, Kerry Von Erich. I remember Dominic Tanucci, Mil Mascaras. They would you never know who was going to show up in our offices. Mark Lewin, right. Paul Heyman, on and on. I could go with the list. And when they showed up, they got their pictures taken. Don Morocco. So if they left another federation and joined the WWF, we had posed centerfold. Remember the centerfolds in PDF color centerfold, or the cover? We had beautiful posed color photography from where they were before, as opposed to access we couldn't get with the WWF. And because Bill was such a gad about it and knew everybody in the business, people would come to visit just to say hi sometimes, pose for a few photos, and go out to lunch. It was just that simple. So we were able to circumvent the fact that we couldn't get pose photography with Billy Jack Haynes joined. Well, our pictures were from Portland, but who could tell?
Right.
He was in Portland, that type of thing, the studio stuff. Bill was a really good studio photographer and a big key to the success of those magazines because, let's say we had Harley Race in the centerfold. He'd just become the king of the WWE, but the picture was from the NWA. Who knew?
Yeah.
Right? So that's how we worked around it.
Did you, I know this might be somewhat random, during your time period at PWI, did you ever, and being in New York, did you ever, maybe visit or meet Herb Abrams or go to any UWF shows?
If you watch the reruns, you'll see me at ringside quite often.
Really?
Yes, we had carte blanche with Bill there. I sat right on the ring apron at one point, just taking notes for the couple of the early shows when they were running the Penn Hotel in New York City.
Yep.
Remember those tapings they had there?
Yep. They were there a lot. Yeah.
They were there a bunch. A noble experiment by the wrong person. What else can I tell you? I mean, history has proven what Herb the type of person Herb was. I can't say anything bad about him because it was just a handshake and a smile with me. I was doing my job. And there was the thing too. I didn't go to. I talk about this a lot. I didn't go to wrestling, even though I had locker room access, but I wasn't there to kibitz with the boys. Yeah. I was there to learn about the promotions.
Yeah.
The angles that I could take that information back and write articles about them. I wasn't interested in, oh boy, I met Cowboy Bob Orton Jr., which I did, but that wasn't my focal point of being there. Other people in the business would seem to want to chum up to the wrestlers. I could have cared less. Yeah. I know the number. I have a handful of wrestlers now I've been in contact with all these years, but I didn't ingratiate myself. I wasn't there to get myself over. I was there to learn about the business. The best time I ever had in wrestling was talking wrestling psychology with Gordon Soley in a lounge, backstage with Eric Embry in Memphis, with Buddy Rogers at a hotel, and just talking what makes wrestling work.
Right.
Because if I could have had a dream job in wrestling, it would have been a booker for somebody. And I wanted to learn that part of the business. I want to learn the business of wrestling more than kibitz with the wrestlers, if that makes any sense to you. You know, because everybody else I knew was like, oh, this guy's my pal, and I rode in a car with, Tony Altamore or something. I didn't care. I was there to learn about the business because I was an older guy. I didn't start with PWI until I was like 28, 29 years old. I already had established. And there's the thing about those magazines. Everybody there was a journalist.
Yeah.
I was a sports writer. We had guys that were still working at Newsday when they worked there. We had Steve Farhood in the boxing department, who now is one of the leading analysts of boxing on SNY Network. You know what I mean? We were all, like we described about PWI, we were all journalists who just happened to like wrestling as opposed to wrestling fans who were trying to be journalists.
Right.
I didn't think that made our magazines a little more literate than the other ones, and we really watched out. Ask Craig Peters. We were always trying to make things grammatically correct. We would have arguments in the office about, you got to say it this way, you can't say it that way. I don't know if it helped, but hey, PWI, like I said, its peak in 83, 84. Craig tells me they literally, at the newsstand, not overall, but at the newsstand, they were outselling the actual Sports Illustrated for a couple of years.
I believe it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's how hot wrestling was in those years. Naturally, I joined in 88 when things were starting to go downhill, but, that's the way it works.
I mean, it was everywhere at that time period, literally. There was cartoons, obviously. There was TV shows. There was... they were making guest appearances in movies and all that kind of stuff. Wrestling was, at that time, the biggest thing. You know what I mean? They were going towards children as an audience. And what happens when that happens, it works. You know what I mean?
Yes, it did. Yeah. It worked. Say what you want about Vince McMahon. I think that his one real genius period was that period.
Yeah.
He made it more palatable. I mean, it certainly wasn't Cobo Hall with the Sheik tearing up Bobo Brazil every Monday night. It was an entirely different flavor. He made it more accessible. Mm-hmm. He homogenized it. But it was that softening of it that made kids want to watch it.
Right.
You weren't going to see anything super duper violent at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning when they showed the show,
Yeah.
The good guys were really good. The bad guys were, a little bit softened, but they were still bad guys. And it worked for... what was it, that golden period between 84 and maybe 87, 88. They were riding pretty high. It worked. And whether I liked it or not has nothing to do with it. It worked for them.
Right. I could still go back and watch it. Maybe not so because I'm just like, man, I want to watch this match because it's a quality match. No. I go back and watch those old episodes of like Superstars and Challenge and stuff because of the memories, not necessarily because I think that there's going to be something really hot on there. If I wanted something really good, I go back and watch like the Crockett era and such, stuff like that.
I was at a Kmart and I bought a DVD of WrestleMania 3 for like $1 or $2. It was in a bin.
Yeah.
And I said, I want to relive this because I remember watching it and thinking it was the biggest thing I think I would ever see in wrestling. That Hogan Andre main event. And there was a scene at the end. It's almost artistic on that original broadcast and the DVD. You see Jesse Ventura and Gorilla Monsoon up in their high perch, looking down on everything. And you see them kind of glance at each other like, can you believe this? I mean, it was total real, the look on their faces. The place was going ape. The cheers were outrageous when Hogan won. And you just see the two of the announcers looking at each other. This was not a work. They were like, this is the biggest thing we've ever seen. That was the look on their faces. And at home, that translated. I thought it was the biggest thing I'd ever seen. I didn't think wrestling could ever get any bigger than that. It probably has in dollars, but I think in terms of recognition, it never did.
I went back and watched WrestleMania 3 probably a month ago. That's a show I thoroughly enjoy because if you look at it, look at the lineup on that show. Lots of great talent, but that Hogan Andre, there's something about the excitement of that match that really does it. You know what I mean? They're two of the biggest. The way that it was done and unfolded, I thought was done perfectly. Is it a technical masterpiece? Not by any means, but it's a phenomenal match just because of the energy. Yeah.
I did a podcast recently about 10 matches you should see.
Yeah.
Right. Seek these out.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of them. I said, this is the worst match on this list. But because, first of all, the whole mainstream world wasn't even into wrestling, wanted to see Hogan against that really big guy. If they didn't know who Andre the Giant was, they did then.
Yeah.
The job of bringing that into the mainstream media was brilliant. I mean, they were on talk shows. They were here and there. The heat, when they were just standing in the ring looking at each other before the match.
Yeah.
The classic moment. They weren't even wrestling. Yeah. Andre with that sneer looking down at Hogan. Hogan slowly inching his way toward Andre. Is there been a better moment in wrestling ever? No. That's as good as it gets. The heat in the arena. Everybody wondering what could Hogan possibly beat this guy? Even my own mother. I remember my mother saying, "How is the blind guy going to beat that big guy?" People who didn't know wrestling were talking about it.
Right.
So it's a legendary match. I don't care that it was two guys stumbling around the ring. Who cares?
Right. It's every move in that match got that crowd going. Every slam, every punch, every kick. The crowd was on fire throughout that entire time.
Yes, absolutely.
It's amazing in that moment because of that.
It is what it was. It was perfect for its moment, like you say. That's wrestling at its best. I mean, it is. And I am so tired of spots and work rate and the things that people use to determine what's good wrestling now.
Yeah.
Bull. If I watch one more guy in the top rope with 6 guys standing there waiting to catch him as he stands up there with his arms raised for 1 solid minute, 60 seconds.
Yeah.
I mean,
those guys just stare at him as he's climbing the ropes. They're not pretending they're hurt. They're not pretending they're injured. They're just literally staring up. They know what he's going to do. Move the hell out of the way.
That's somebody what happened during a sporting event. Yes. That's right. Yeah. You see what I'm saying? Why does everybody have to wrestle the same way? Why does every match have to have 50 high spots? Why can't we have a slugfest and that's all it is? That's what made the Guta match so interesting. It was a slugfest, old school, bare knuckles brawl. Awesome, right?
Yeah.
I mean, meanwhile, you had the Charlotte Flair versus Rhea Ripley match, which did have a lot of high spots in it.
Yeah.
But they were so evenly matched and so athletic that there wasn't anything really corny that happened in that match. Anything that made you think, oh, that's over the top. It was really well mapped out, that match. So they can still do it when they feel like it,
Yeah.
They can still present wrestling that will make you just get lost in it. And that's what you want to feel. That's what you want to experience.
And I go to a lot of indie shows here in Connecticut, and it's like by the third match you've probably seen, and I know this, 327 super kicks. That's the other thing.
Oh yeah, you're right.
It's just, geez, man, every match has had a super kick. First, it's the double super kick by the tag team, and it's just like, come on, man, this is just, it gets to be too much, too repetitive. It's like these guys, it's like, all right, they don't talk to each other in the back. It's like, are you doing this? There's so many of the same spots on the show. You know what I mean?
As a blues musician, I can tell you that when you play a blues festival, the first thing you do is walk around and see who's playing what song, because everybody does covers. And if somebody's playing Sweet Home Chicago, you don't play that song because they will have heard it before. You would figure these wrestlers standing in the locker room would go, who's doing this, who's doing that? I don't want to repeat it, but no, nobody even checks now. You know what I mean? It's the same thing. Once you've seen it 3 times, it kind of loses its luster a little bit. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. You know, so it's a similar thing. I don't understand why you could offer the same maneuvers over and over again on a card. No, same finishes too. Sometimes it's amazing.
Oh yeah. That's why there's very few guys, and I don't mean to insult my local area, which I've become quite friendly with a lot of the guys here. It's just that there's certain guys that I just literally gravitate towards because I know they're going to put on a good match and they're not going to do the same exact spots as everybody else did. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like they know, they get the psychology of the professional wrestling, and it's just that's pretty much it on that.
Yeah, no, I understand. Look, you know, in Long Island here, there's a couple of organizations, Victory Pro Wrestling and Creative Pro Wrestling.
Yep. Every
so often a gem falls out of there, like MJF.
Victory ran here once last summer. I went to their show. That was I don't know if that was their first out of state show or not, but I attended, and I for the most part I enjoyed what I saw. Not everything, but for the most part.
Right. But you know what? It's like when you go to see a minor league baseball game, Class A game, you can pick a guy out of a lineup and go, that guy's going to be something.
Yep.
And these organizations, probably the ones you see too, you never know which one of these guys is going to make it big on the national level sometime soon.
Yeah.
I can think of another guy in Creative Pro. I think he's working for Victory. I'm not going to mention his name because I don't want to embarrass him, but I think he's going to make it. I can feel it in my bones. I don't like his gimmick now, but I could tell there's something different about this guy that's going to push him forward. So that's exciting to me. It's like, you know, it reminds me of the days when I wrote the introducing features in the Wrestler magazine. You know, I was the one that wrote for the time I was there, the rookies, the young guys, the guys who were just making a name for themselves in the territory. This is the same thing all over again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the future of the sport rests with these kids. So, and when you see somebody who's really good, your head just spins because it's like, wow, you know, even now, I'm sure you see somebody out there that you just know is going to make it. Is that true? I mean, you probably see more indie cards than I do at this point.
I used to go to 2-3 a month, to be honest with you. This year has been my slowest year. I don't know if it's because I'm getting older or I'm spending time with my family more on Fridays and Saturdays. I probably literally last year was probably my busiest year. It's just like there's one coming up next week. You know, I informed everybody I was coming, but at the same time, I'm sitting there like today I sat there. I'm like to my wife, I just don't think I want to go. Literally, I think I'm just going to stay home and spend time with my wife and instead. And there's just comes a time where I'm just not interested in certain things because I've seen it all before.
Well, I will say this. Thank you, Christopher Cruz or Chris Cruz from the old announcer on, I think he's on both Facebook primarily.
Yeah.
He's always running wrestling posters and going, how are these people getting
bad indie posters? Right. That's just the hashtag. Yeah.
But that doesn't bother me. You know, the fact that somebody's out of shape or young or skinny, that doesn't bother me as much as the names of the organizations, even Psychotic Wrestling Federation, Bloodlust Wrestling League. You know what I'm saying? There's no psychology there. You can't imagine piling the 2 kids in your car. Let's go to wrestling. You're not going to that.
No, and you know when that started, and I believe that this was when ECW became extreme, that everybody tried to emulate that in a way. So they would come up with some name. That's not regional sounding. That would be just a general sound. So, you know, there's Anarchy. There's what the hell, Insane Wrestling. There's all sorts of, and it's just like, you know, I tend to not watch wrestling that sounds like that.
No,
I don't want to. Yeah,
and I read somewhere that Rob Black made a comeback with his ridiculous.
Oh God,
you know,
did you see the controversy over the last show?
I heard it. Yeah, I read it.
Yeah, like and he's sitting, and if you follow him on Twitter at all, which or saw the stuff that he said on Twitter, he's proud of it.
Yes, he is.
He's proud of it, and I don't necessarily want to say what happened here.
You don't even have to. People will look it up when they hear us talk about it.
Yeah.
And I think you should, because you know why? They've only gone 15 miles past the boundaries that wrestling should have.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's ridiculous what they did at that show.
Yeah. And, I know somebody that used to work there for him, like in the original run towards the end.
Mm-hmm.
And they just said that he was just like this really weird dude at that time period. And it's just, he's in a world of his own, literally.
Well, he was an extreme pornographer who brings that flavor to wrestling. What more do I need to say? That's what he does.
Yeah. And nobody, like, I'm not into the deathmatch stuff. I've never been into that deathmatch stuff. When it comes into the, I guess as far as I go with the extreme stuff would be like watching stuff like Abdullah or the Sheik or stuff like that. I'm not into the thumbtacks, the stabbing of people with literally pizza cutters and all that weird stuff. It's just, I can't get into that.
Well, here's part of the problem. The fans are part of the problem. The young fans are part of the problem too.
100%.
Because I commented on this, and a bunch of us did. I know Al Snow did. There's a clip from a match from one of these hotshot federations, right? Or hot shotting federations.
Right.
Of a female wrestler dumping another female wrestler off a balcony. She hits what appears to be head first on the apron.
Jesus. Yeah.
And everybody on Twitter who wasn't a wrestling fan said, is she dead or did she die? That's how bad this bump looked.
Yeah.
Now, apparently it wasn't that bad, but that's not the point. You got fans doing the usually holy bleep. The idea that this woman may be suffering flies out the window because somebody took a life-risking bump for your entertainment. I'm never going to be into that. I'm sorry. That's 50 steps too far. You know what I'm saying?
There was a kid here, a young kid.
Your opponent.
There was a young kid here a number of years back. He was doing like high flying spots and stuff like that. A lot of that stuff is really dangerous, and it's unfortunate. And I think that this was probably earlier 2000s, probably. I'm trying to think about when this was, but I just remember I wasn't at this particular show, but I just remember being on social media that night and seeing it on the wrestling news sites that this kid landed on his head going for a spot on a high school gym floor. You know how hard that is?
Yeah.
He died. Literally. A guy, and it was only like, 15, 20 minutes from where I live. And I just remember being so heartbroken because he was a really good kid. He would just go for those high risk stuff, like maneuvers, and he just landed head first and his body couldn't take it. And it's just stuff like that that just really irritates me. Like seeing spots like that, deathmatch spots like that. There's no story in it.
No, and they're doing it in front of 15 to 300 people who won't even remember it. They're just waiting for the next bump.
You're lucky if there's 300 people in the crowd, to be honest.
In front of a dozen people. I mean,
or somebody's backyard.
And I think some of these kids are deluded into thinking that these extreme spots will make them reach the big time someday. I think it's the opposite.
Nobody's going to want to go for somebody. I mean, like the WWE is not going to reach out. I mean, granted, Moxley was like a deathmatch guy beforehand, but maybe he's the exception. But they're not going to reach out to people if they're all mangled and looking crazy.
Yeah. So, Chris Cruz shows these posters and they all look like psycho killers. And it's like, who's packing the kids with, let's go eat hot dogs at the high school gym watching these derelicts bang each other with fluorescent light tubes, No. I hate garbage wrestling. I'm sorry. I just do.
No, you're right. Me too. And he has a particular love for George South as well. I don't know if you've seen his George South posts.
You know what? I have spent a lot of time talking to George South when I was with PWI, and he's one of the nicest people I've ever met. That's as far as I'm going to take it. If he's still working, is that smart? Maybe not. But you know what? More power to him if he can do it. You know what? I guarantee he respects his body and his opponents respect his body. And they put on old school wrestling matches where they can give probably some pretty decent action without hurting each other for real.
Yeah.
I'll take that over guys, cutting their ears off with pizza cutters any day of the week. That's fine.
No, you're right. You're right. Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to cover?
Well, other than my podcast, which I hope people will check out. I started it in January of this year. I'm really happy with the response. I am happy with the guests we've had. I'm happy to come on your show now. It's called the Outdated Wrestling Hour. If you haven't heard it, we try to be whimsical and upbeat at the beginning of the shows, even if we cover important topics for the past. Our eye is strictly on the past. We did do a WrestleMania show, but that's only because I watched it and I figured I'd just throw that out there as a bonus episode. But most of the time we're looking at things, we're trying to give information. We did a show on great YouTube matches and where to even find YouTube matches for somebody who might not know, books you should read, videos you should watch, other podcasts you should listen to. We're trying to keep the flavor of traditional professional wrestling alive. That's it. There's no other motive. I don't have a Patreon. I'm not trying to raise $1 million doing this. I'm doing it because I still love this stuff. I know you do too.
Yeah.
And just hearing back from the fans and the people who followed me from the John Arizzi podcast that I used to be on. I was on John Arizzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight for a year. Those fans followed me to where I am now, and I appreciate every one of them. We're all having a blast. And I think the show's getting better week by week. And, I'm learning this crazy podcasting stuff. I know there's 8 gazillion wrestling podcasts. It's tough to make a niche for yourself.
Right.
But I think our podcast is a little different. It has enough of a new flavor to it that I think people will enjoy it. And I hope people try it. And that's basically what I'm about these days. I'm not writing anymore. I actually work for a sports media company in Long Island, but the media writing I'm doing is it's just kind of inner office, that type of thing. Yeah. You know what? I had offers to do wrestling websites. I'm not learning SEO writing. It goes against everything I've ever been about. I learned how to write like a professional writer. I'm not going to write like a salesman. I won't do it. I'm old now. I don't need it. It's you know what I'm saying? You got to have some standards or you'll just be a sellout. I don't want to sell out my skill. I'm proud of the way I write. I'm proud of my bookshelf full of awards for being a good writer. I'm you know what I'm saying? It's like,
absolutely.
I'm not going to give it up for, some extra bucks. It's not going to happen.
No. I want everybody to go check out the show. It's called the Outdated Wrestling Hour. It's become one of my favorites, my go-to podcast weekly.
Are you serious? I really appreciate that.
I swear to God. You're one of the very few that I continue to listen to. As we,
you're knocking me out. You're flooring me. No, seriously, because you've been around at this a lot longer than I have, and you've established a really nice reputation for your work. And the fact that somebody like you would say something like that, considering I put out 13 shows.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. You've gotten some really great stories, your time in the, writing, and, you had Craig Peters on at one point, and I thought that was a really great episode. Just recently with Brian Solomon, who his podcast is another that I can't wait for Wednesdays when his drops.
Me too. I love his podcast.
His show is amazing. So, maybe one day I can actually have him on here. I'd love to speak to him being so local and stuff like that to me. I do see him at shows every now and again. So one of these days I'll say hi to him.
You know what? He is a amazingly rounded person. He's a family man on top of everything else.
Yeah.
He is stultifyingly normal, which I find scintillating. You know what I mean? He's like, he's a rock solid individual. And he has high standards, and he just wrote the best wrestling book I've ever read in my life. And I don't want to say the best. I always say that on the show. I don't want to say the best, the greatest, because you can't quantify it.
Right.
For me, Blood and Fire, the story of the Sheik, is the best wrestling book I've ever read, because it's like I told him, it's a book I've waited my whole life to read, because I didn't know. I never got to see the Sheik till I was like 20, 21 years old. But I was always fascinated by his shtick, the fire throwing and all the great old pictures of him against Blassie and against Bobo Brazil. And now I know everything about him thanks to that book. And I learned stuff about the territories in that book I never fathomed. I honestly didn't know that Detroit burned out as fast as it did.
Yeah.
It was like, they were on top of the world in 73 and just about ready to call it quits by 75. That's quick.
Yeah, that's not long at all.
No. And you know what, though? Because the wrestling magazines kept covering the Sheik like he was the ultimate villain, even when he was on the skids.
he was still wrestling in the 90s in Japan. You know what I mean? Going over there once in a while. It was insane.
Have you read the book yet?
I've read some of it. I haven't finished
I don't want to
have
comment on that because there's factors about those final Japan years that he did that I think you'll find surprising. He did great. He could barely walk, and he was still main eventing those cards.
Yeah.
I mean, the Japanese held him in such, I don't know what to say, they revered him because of what he was. It's the same way with Abdullah the Butcher.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he kept going to Japan when he could barely walk, but you know, there was something they appreciated what they brought to the ring, and they never. The Japanese really seem to never forget. You know, they don't forget the stars that made their youths, I guess, and they always pay tribute to the veterans, probably better than they do here in the United States.
Oh, I think
how many promoters have cut loose a legend just because they thought he was too old?
Yeah, that's the difference between here and there. The in Japan, it's one of the things I like. Before we get out of here, I just want to say that's the difference between Japan and America. It's treated like an actual sport in Japan.
Right. Yeah.
Covered by the major news outlets. It's on in the newspapers. You know what I mean? It's like they keep kayfabe over there still. I'm not sure how, but you know, with all the exposure, but it's still considered a major sport over there, and that to me that fascinates me, and I still somewhat keep up on you know, things like New Japan and All Japan and Noah currently.
Mm-hmm. I respect Japanese wrestling greatly. I mean, it's just. It is its own animal, and I'm glad that it survives to this day.
Yeah, me too.
They have a little more integrity than we do over here, it seems too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Bob, I want to thank you for coming on here. Like, this was a blast, and I'd love to have you on again.
I'll tell you what, you have just earned if you will come on my show.
Absolutely.
Would you like to come on my show?
Sure.
Okay, we're going to do that then. We're going to do it because you know what? This exceeded my expectations tenfold. I had such a wonderful time talking, and we seem to have even though you're younger than I am, I think our vibes are the same in terms of what we miss about professional wrestling.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, there's the difference. I never thought I would embrace getting older, but the way I am is through wrestling. Because I want to impart the vibe that we had, the importance that we felt about wrestling to the younger fans who may listen, or to other older fans who feel the same way. When I write something on Facebook or something, I just wrote something about the Sheik, and people chimed in going, yeah, I agree. It's because we all felt that way. I don't want that vibe to die. I don't want that vibe of having to buy the wrestling magazines, having to see the matches, scheme as a kid to get your tickets and go to wherever town wrestling was nearby. Those were magical feelings. Like I said, I watched preliminary wrestlers in Albany and had the time of my life. Nothing has ever made me feel like professional wrestling does. And I don't want that vibe to go away. It's just that simple. And if my silly little podcast helps, then I did my job.
No,
I swear to God, I'm not doing it for the money. I'm never going to get rich doing this stuff.
Right.
You know, I just want, you know, Jerry Jarrett died.
Yeah.
I don't want that to be a blurb somewhere in some newspaper. I want people to talk about that. Remember the incredible job he did as a territory. Mm-hmm. I want to bring back the territories if we could, you know,
that was a magical time. There was so many incredible things going on with the territories. It was awesome.
If nothing else, you know, the WWE Hall of Fame with the Kaufman thing had people talking about Memphis wrestling again.
Right.
That's important.
Yeah.
So you know,
I should break out my Memphis DVDs and show them to you sometime, or take pictures and show them. I got the Kaufman DVD that I think High Spots produced it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is a while back, a couple years back. Yeah.
No, I'm the biggest fan of I'm From Hollywood that's out there. Yeah. I love the scenes more than anything in the movie of the Memphis people sitting on their back porches talking about the intricacies of the Kaufman-Lawler feud. That is art. You got real people, you know, a kid going, I think he should have killed him. And an old lady goes, I just don't like it. I mean, that's wrestling. That was the vibe about bad guy wrestlers when I was a kid. You know, the ladies in the front row at the Washington Avenue Armory, hair, when the referee would miss the guy pulling hair. I love that stuff. I'm sorry. I just.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. Thank
rest
you.
my case.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, absolutely. Bob, I want to thank you so much for coming on rather, excuse me. You talked a bit about your podcast, but where could people find you, Bob, the person?
Okay. I'm hoping I can remember all this at the top of my head because I read it off a sheet on my podcast. No, I have a Gmail set up just for the podcast called Outdated Wrestling at gmail.com. You could find me on Twitter as Bob Smith NYC. Real simple. I'm in New York City, so Bob Smith NYC. On Facebook, I'm Robert Smith. Just you'll see me. You'll see me in the little deal. That's basically where you can find me at this point. I was a blues singer in the name of Robert Charles. All my records are on Spotify and Amazon from the old days. I made 4 albums. I performed with B.B. King 10 times. I toured the country for 15 years after I left PWI on and off. It was the second greatest thrill I ever had. It was being able to perform it. I played the Chicago Blues Festival twice. I was on the House of Blues Radio Hour with Dan Aykroyd twice. Wow. I didn't make demos, man. I made good music. So if anybody ever wants to check that, it's free. Just ask Alexa to play it. You can hear it. Robert Charles is spelled Charles. That's my father's. My father's name was Charles, so I used his name as my last name on stage as a tribute to him when he died. That's basically it. And you can find me on Spotify and all the same places you find Rick Del Santo. You can find me. That's the best way to put it. Wherever you are in the podcast world, you can find me there too. All those apps and sites and stuff like that.
I'm going to put all the contact, all those links in the description of this episode.
We do have a website. It's outdatedwrestlinghour.buzzsprout.com. Buzzsprout is our podcast host.
Okay.
So, and that gives you the entire. You know what? All the shows are listed. You can just hit a button and listen to them there if you don't feel like. I know a lot of older fans, and I swear to God, when I first announced I was doing a podcast, the older fans that I attract were like, "I don't do apps." Seriously, I was answering people on Twitter. I don't even know what an app is. I said, "All right, go to the website," and those are the people that go to the website and just listen to it off the web,
right?
That's what they have. Fine by me. Hey, ratings point is a ratings point, right, man?
There you go. I'm a Roku guy. I have I have my apps on my phone. As I'm getting older, I know I love physical media, but I'm getting to the point where can't do it anymore.
No, I have gone kicking and screaming into I was the last one to buy a smartphone. Now I can't live without it. It's like I just thought, what are these people doing spending $700 on the phone? Well, now I know, because it's like it's invaluable as a communications tool. It really is. Once you discover what a smartphone does, you go, how did I live without this my whole life?
Absolutely.
And if there's an emergency, what's better than having a smartphone? I mean, come on.
Remember, there was an era. If there was an emergency, you'd be stuck. So now having a cell phone, people don't realize how helpful it is.
No, it absolutely is. And you know what's underrated in emergency? I don't mean to get off target.
You're
Keep
good.
an AM radio nearby.
Yeah.
With your local news station on, and just even if you don't listen to it, keep one with batteries in it. You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's my tip of the week, folks. No, I mean this. You know why? Because I was driving one time in New Hyde Park, New York, here in Long Island, and we had a hurricane so bad heading our way that the sky was the color of split pea soup. I never saw anything like it in my life. Green sky. And the guy on WCBS News Radio said, if you're in the New Hyde Park area, please pull your car over. I went, holy smokes. I mean, it was like magic. So I pulled my car over and I missed a mess. I rest my case.
Wow.
Old school AM news radio is an important thing because it never shuts off, Always Absolutely. Up to date. So, but anyway, Rick, I'm sorry, I'm babbling.
No, you're good. You're good. Thank you so much.
I'm old, man. Old people talk too much.
Yeah, no, I would go on forever if I could. But yeah, man, I thank you so much, and I definitely want to have you here again. So down the road, maybe we can do some
podcast, man. Yeah. You can count on it. I promise you that. And I want to thank all your listeners too. And keep supporting this guy. He's working his butt off. He's on YouTube. He's got a great thing on YouTube with all kinds of different people. Can I ask you one question?
Absolutely.
You ever YouTube with the guy says he's from Blood, Sweat, and Tears? Is that the band or is that the name of a wrestling company?
No. That's a wrestling
okay,
company.
right.
That's a wrestling company here.
I'm old.
Based out of Bridgeport, Connecticut. So
I was going, oh man, maybe he knows David Clayton Thomas. I
I do know who that is. I worked in a record store for 30 years.
I did too.
So,
Which one did you work for?
Right here in they were based out of West Haven, Connecticut at first, and then they moved to Hamden, Connecticut. Replay Records. It was a used record shop. I worked there for 30 years.
Wow.
I've learned so much about music in the during that time period. My first, growing up, my first musical obsession was Elvis Presley.
Wow.
As the years went on, I just discovered more and more, and surrounded by great music. My mother listened to oldies radio growing up. It opened me to that, and then, I listened to everything. There's no limits.
Guess what I did for about 4 years? I was in my early 20s. I managed Record World stores in the New York metropolitan area.
I remember them from the shopping mall. Yeah.
Yes, the shopping mall chain. Yeah, Roosevelt Field. And I worked in Middletown, New York, and I worked in Poughkeepsie, New York, upstate. It was one of the first full-time jobs I ever had. Busted my butt. It was hard work. But
actually, my cousin was a manager of a Record World somewhere in Connecticut, like far out in Connecticut. Can't remember the town, of course.
They grew pretty well for a while, and then what killed Record World was CDs.
Yeah,
because
they couldn't keep up. But
they not only could they not keep up, they had millions of dollars worth of record and cassette inventory that nobody wanted anymore. That'll kill you. Existing stale inventory will knock you dead for a loop. But you know what? Bless them all, because I had a lot of good friends at Record World. So I've had 5 different careers, man. What can I tell you?
All right. Thank you. Hang tight.
Thank you.